here. And when it became convenient for Michael Cohen to cooperate, well, he did. But until that point, he was, what they're saying essentially is that he was committing crimes left and right.
Right.
It's not as if he needed the money. They're saying it's not as if he needed the money. He was just doing it. He was being deceptive. It was greed.
Right. They pointed to his greed.
Yeah. So I don't know if they have an incentive. It's just they're looking at all the information that they have. And this is what they're seeing, and this is what they believe should be the penalty for the crimes that he has committed.
Now, but you're saying, though, that this definitely, both offices would have been in agreement on both of these memos.
Yeah, this is, if you look at the document, they're talking about the special counsel's office and the cooperation with the special counsel's office, and these crimes are being prosecuted by the Southern District of New York. And so, yeah, this is a consensus document. These investigations, at least in this document, in a way they've come together, they've merged, and they've come up with this sentencing recommendation. So that's what we're seeing here.
Right. I'm just going to reread. I read parts of it, but I'm going to reread the conclusion from the special counsel's office.
You're doing a great job of reading through all this. I gotta say, it's 40 pages and it's complicated, but you're doing a great job, Tanya.
We're doing it in real time, Jeff, in real time. I just want to reread some of the conclusion from the special counsel's office. The defendant's crime, and again, we're talking about Michael Cohen, the defendant's crime was serious, both in terms of the underlying conduct and its effect on multiple government investigations. The sentence imposed should reflect the fact that lying to federal investigators has real consequences, especially where the defendant lied to investigators about critical facts in an investigation of national importance. However, the defendant has made substantial and significant efforts to remediate his misconduct, accept responsibility for his actions, and assist the SCO's investigation. Accordingly, the government respectfully submits that the court should give due consideration to the defendant's efforts set forth above, and that it would be appropriate to allow the defendant to serve any sentence imposed in this case concurrently with any sentence imposed in United States versus Cohen. So they are seeking to give him a little bit of a break there. They
are, and I'm going to jump ahead. Did you already read page 37?
No, go right ahead.
All right, I'm going to go to page 37 because at the bottom of page 37 it says, finally, Cohen's further assertion that he is deserving of leniency because he, quote, could have fought the government and continued to hold the party line, positioning himself for a pardon or clemency, reflects a continuation of his mindset that at his own option, he is above the laws reflected in his crimes of conviction. So that is also interesting as well, because in his sentencing memo, the one that his attorney put forward, he said that he was essentially lying to protect the president.
Right. Well,
individual one.
Right. I just want to be clear, though. You were just reading from the sentencing memo from the Southern District of from the special prosecutor of the Southern District of New York. What I'd been reading earlier was the special memo that was filed by the special counsel's office. So it was almost as if, the special counsel's office almost sounds as if it's trying to lighten the blow just a little bit by saying, well, here are all the ways that Michael Cohen has helped and is continuing to help our investigation. Just to be clear, while it sounds as if the prosecutor from the Southern District of New York is a lot harsher and a lot less willing to give Michael Cohen credit for that cooperation.
Yeah, right. It sounds like good cop, bad cop, right? But if you're Michael Cohen, you're looking at this and seeing 63 months, right? 63 months. And it's important that you pointed that out, Tanya. So this is weighty stuff for Michael Cohen. He is someone who, as I said, worked for the Trump organization for about a decade, was close to the president. He has a family. He is someone who has obviously succeeded on many levels in business. But over the last 2 years, he has essentially been under this scrutiny because of actions taken leading up to and during the 2016 campaign. And then those actions were compounded by the lies that investigators believe he told to cover up some of those actions. Lying to Congress, for example, that's what he pleaded guilty to. About this Trump Tower in Moscow deal. This is something that originally he said, talk about that ended in January of 2016 before the presidential campaign really heated up. But that wasn't the case.
Right.
And that was something that he lied to members of Congress about in their investigation.
So, Jeff, do you think it's safe to say that Cohen's lawyers are surprised by this, or do you think that they had some indication that this was coming?
They may have had some inkling that this is coming, but I'm sure they're surprised. I'm sure they're not happy with this outcome, considering that they were asking for no time behind bars.
Right. Right.
So this is not what they were looking for. I have not heard from Michael Cohen about this. I've been checking my email and my phone to see if he has any reaction to this. And he was checking text messages earlier today, so he was alert to some of the questions that we had for him earlier today, but he didn't respond to those questions. But we'll just have to see what comes out of this for him now. Obviously he goes through the weekend with this sentencing, the middle of next week, ahead of him.
He would probably be wise to lay low in terms of a public comment. But, Jeff, stand by, if you will. I want to bring in now Bob Litt. He is a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General and former General Counsel for the Director of National Intelligence. Bob, thank you so much for being with us. I know you, like us, are still reading through this, but could you give us your first impressions?
So a couple of thoughts come to my mind. The first is that Michael Cohen lost his gamble by not agreeing to cooperate fully. Typically, when somebody agrees to cooperate, they agree to a full debriefing by the government. They tell the government everything, and the government then comes in at the time of sentencing and says this person deserves a substantial break for cooperation in the way that Muller did for Michael Flynn. Michael Cohen didn't do that, and he gambled that by cooperating on his own, he would get a substantial break in sentence, and that doesn't appear to be the case. The Southern District of New York's memo does say that they think he should get some credit. And so they are, while they don't recommend a specific length of time, they do suggest that he should get a sentence somewhat lower than the guidelines range, which is guidelines ranges in the range of 4.5 to 5 years. But they seem to suggest that the recommendation of the probation department, which was 3.5 years, might be an appropriate sentence for him.
Yeah, I'm just going to read right from the memo. It says the credit should not approximate the credit a traditional cooperating witness would receive, given, among other reasons, Cohen's affirmative decision not to become one, as you pointed out. What was his reasoning there? Why did he not become a full cooperating witness?
Well, what he said was that he was afraid that if he became a full cooperating witness, he wouldn't be sentenced until the end of all the various legal proceedings, and he wanted to get this over with and get on with his life. If you read between the lines of the Southern District memorandum, you might come to the conclusion that he did not want to, in fact, be fully candid about all the things that he had done, which he would have had to do if he had fully cooperated, because the Southern District says he was not willing to talk about other criminal activity that he might have engaged in. One of the things that this means is that he's probably never going to be used as a witness by the government in any case, because they won't put him on the stand if he hasn't been fully truthful to them.
So, Bob, what position then does the Muller memo put a judge in? Because it seems to essentially say his crimes are serious, yes, but his cooperation was significant. It almost seems as if the special counsel's office wants to soften the blow a little bit.
I would not go so far as to say that. First of all, I would assume that there's been some coordination between the Southern District of New York and the Special Counsel's office on what they're saying here. And I think the Special Counsel is very careful not to step on the Southern District's recommendation in any way. They say only that whatever sentence is imposed on Cohen in their case, which is a separate false statement prosecution, they would agree to have that run concurrently with the other sentence. And the fact of the matter is it might well have run concurrently anyway. The guidelines range for a simple false statement is fairly low. I think it's 0 to 6 months. And so I think Mueller is being very careful not in any way to interfere with the Southern District's recommendation.
Bob, I want to get into the memo from the Special Counsel's office in just a second. But first, I want to ask you, as all this relates to the Manafort memo, we're being told that it is being allowed to be filed under seal, but some redacted material will be released. Does this mean we won't be able to see as much as what we'd hoped?
Yes. I think that as he did with Flynn, Mueller is making very clear that he's not interested in establishing a public record. He's more interested in protecting his investigation. The fact that there are going to be redactions here suggests that there are matters on ongoing investigations to which Manafort's lies relate. But we'll have to see that when we get the redacted memo. I understand the court has ordered a redacted memo to be filed, but that hasn't been filed yet, at least as of a few minutes ago.
I do want to get into some of the details, though, of this memo, because I think we're getting a window into some of the Mueller investigation, into some of the details that we hadn't had before. Some of the talk about I'm going to quote right from the memo that Cohen spoke with a Russian national who claimed to be a trusted person in the Russian Federation who could offer the campaign political synergy and synergy on a government level. I mean, some of this is it's about as close as we've gotten to what Mueller must be diving into. The person told Cohen that such a meeting could have a phenomenal impact, not only in political, but in a business dimension as well. And of course, this is referring to the Moscow project, because there is no bigger warranty in any project than consent of, and then in brackets, the president of Russia. What do you read here?
Well, Tanya, you skipped a sentence there, which is a critical sentence, which is the defendant recalled that this person, the Russian, repeatedly proposed a meeting between individual one, who's President Trump, and the president of Russia. And that's the meeting that's being referred to there. So it's clear that the Russians were making efforts to reach out to the Trump campaign and offer varieties of assistance. What we don't see in here is the other side, which is how the Trump campaign reacted. We do see that if you're a little further down, it says Cohen provided relevant and useful information concerning his contacts with persons connected to the White House during the 2017-2018 time period. But we don't really see in here whether there was a positive reaction to any of this from the Trump campaign.
Right. Although it does seem that, like you said, the overtures from the Russians were, sort of more wide-ranging than we had originally thought, and seemed to be, pretty forceful.
Yes, I think that's fair.
Yeah. All right. So, Bob, please stand by. CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns is here with me now and is joining us also. So, Caitlin, from a Washington standpoint, what do you think the fallout is going to be from these Cohen sentencing guidelines?
Well, we knew that that Cohen was cooperating with the special counsel, but the big question mark we had today was what was the extent to that cooperation? And here we're seeing a few more details about what that was like. We know that, for example, Cohen met with the special counsel 7 different times, and as you were just discussing, he was helpful. The special counsel says in 4 different ways. One, identifying those contacts, explaining those contacts. Remember, why we're interested in Cohen is because last week when he pleaded guilty, he gave some information really about his conversations about this Trump project. And we were really wanting to know kind of what else that entailed and what that financial agreement was like. And as we're going through this, we know that he has been cooperating with the special counsel. Now, to your point earlier, we don't know what the link is between individual one and kind of the directions he was given. But what we saw from the court, the earlier court filing from the Southern District, is that Cohen, as described, was very kind of conniving about all of this and kind of knew exactly what he was doing.
No, it's true. I mean, here it says he admitted he'd lied to Congress and the SAO about the Moscow project while providing detailed information about the true circumstances of the Moscow project later, including its duration, the persons involved in the discussions, the contacts with Russian government officials, and discussions during the first half of 2016 about the possibility of travel to Russia in connection with the Moscow project. Again, that's an important timeline. We've been discussing that, the importance of what was happening in the early parts of 2016.
Right, and how and whether and how they were happening, those conversations, while Trump was getting closer and closer to the nomination, not just a candidate. Remember, last week Trump dismissed this as saying, well, I was still a businessman at the time, right. and we've seen that the campaign was much further along. Right. And we also know that he has repeatedly tried to distance himself from Michael Cohen, as we see from the Southern District of New York filing that Cohen was described as the ultimate fixer and very intimately involved in a lot of these decisions by Trump Organization. We've seen the president distance himself, also dismiss Cohen, dismiss his intelligence, say that Cohen is basically just angling for a better prison sentence or no prison sentence. And so it will be interesting to see how the president reacts. Remember, he's been tweeting all morning about the Mueller investigation. We knew that these court filings would come out this afternoon. It's been top of mind of the president. We also know that the president nominated a new attorney general this morning. And
the president has not yet tweeted about this, as far as we know. There's been no response from the White House, right, Caitlin, so far?
So far, but we have the alerts on.
It's interesting because there is some information. Cohen explained, according to the memo, Cohen explained that he did not pursue the proposed meeting after talking about this Russian national who proposed a meeting several times between individual one and the president of Russia. Cohen explained he did not pursue the proposed meeting, which did not take place, in part because he was working on the Moscow project with a different individual whom Cohen understood to have his own connections to the Russian government. So there seemed to be several either Russian nationals or persons with connections to the Russian government with whom Cohen was speaking. And
those contacts, just given the way in which the special counsel laid out the ways that Cohen has been helpful, identified the explaining of those contacts as part of that as well. Right. And remember, we have several people now that have been talking to the special counsel. And we saw, of course, Michael Flynn in the memo earlier this week. Now, we don't know the extent to which Flynn has cooperated, but Flynn met with the special counsel 19 times. Of course, he served in the administration, also through the transition, also in the campaign. So that's significant as well.
Now, you know, as we said earlier, we're all going through this memo in real time. I'm wondering if there's any more information about the women that he paid off that we can glean from Section 4, which talks about Cohen's illegal campaign contributions. It says that during the campaign, Cohen played a central role in two similar schemes to purchase the rights to stories, each from women who claim to have had an affair with individual one, whom we know to be Donald Trump, so as to suppress the stories and thereby prevent them from influencing the election. With respect to both payments, Cohen acted with the intent to influence the 2016 presidential election. Cohen coordinated his actions with one or more members of the campaign. That's interesting, including through meetings and phone calls about the fact, nature, and timing of the payments. Is that the first time we've heard that Cohen coordinated his efforts with members of the campaign?
That's a big question that we've had. And remember, this relates to campaign finance violations that the president and others have tried to dismiss. But here we're seeing that they really did have an impact. And that Cohen, you know, quote, deceived the voting public by hiding alleged facts that he believed would have had a substantial effect on the election, federal prosecutor said.
Right, and of course, according to Cohen, both payments he acted in coordination with and at the direction of Donald Trump. That is, though, interesting, though. Who else, what other members of the campaign could have known about? I mean, of course, we're all speculating here, but what other members of the campaign could have known about those payments? That is something that people will be looking into for sure. But that is another reason that the Special Prosecutor's Office in the Southern District of New York is recommending jail time for Michael Cohen. A lot to go through here.
A lot to go through here, and it's important that these came out together. We have the filing from the Southern District and the companion filing from the Special Counsel. So we saw what the crimes were that were committed, and we're also seeing the level of cooperation that Cohen then had with the Special Counsel, and that's detailed in 4 different ways.
Right. All right. So, Jeff, if you're still with us, I understand you've had a chance to look through the document a little more thoroughly. I just want to remind our viewers that we are discussing the sentencing guidelines for Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's former personal attorney, and the prosecutors of the Southern District of New York are recommending pretty harsh sentence, a range of somewhere between 51 to 63 months, with some consideration for his cooperation. So, Jeff, what more can you tell us?
Well, scanning through the special counsel's sentencing memo here, what stood out is something, Tanya, that you discussed earlier, this November 2015 interaction between Cohen and someone, a quote, trusted person in the Russian Federation. You know, as someone who has covered this investigation from the beginning, that is a new date that stands out, because that's during the primary season, November of 2015, where very clearly here, according to the special counsel's office, you have Russian operatives reaching out to people around then candidate Trump, Michael Cohen, who's pretty close to then candidate Trump, Mr. Trump. And so what this document says is that Cohen received the contact information for and spoke with a Russian national who claimed to be a trusted person in the Russian Federation who could offer the campaign political synergy and synergy on a government level. I think that is an important revelation here. Because if you look at the overall investigation, that's what it is about. You know, not to say that this is a smoking gun or anything along those lines, but what investigators have been looking into is whether there was this coordination. And if Michael Cohen is acknowledged to the special counsel's office that he spoke to someone who was trusted in the Russian Federation, and what that means is someone close to the Kremlin, ultimately someone who in some way or another has access to Vladimir Putin.
Right. I agree with you, Jeff, that revelation to me seems like the most damning information we've gotten so far into what Cohen may have given the special counsel's office. And like you said, that date, November 2015, is significant.
Yeah, I really think, you know, it's on page 6 of the special counsel's document. Mm-hmm. But you're right. I think it is really important because there were obviously, what we know based on the timeline, there were other efforts between November of 2015 and really through the general election, where you had Russian operatives and probably different Russian operatives reaching out to people in the campaign. So they were trying to get around the campaign and have an influence on the campaign. And that's why I think this new date, November of 2015, is so important. And what the special counsel is saying in this document is so important, that political synergy and synergy on a government level. Just think about that. What they were offering there is for the Kremlin essentially to offer their help to a candidate for the President of the United States.
And then that person goes on to say that the phenomenal impact would not only be in political, but in a business dimension as well. To me, that's equally as damning, because, of course, there are other lawsuits, as you know, from the attorneys general of Maryland and Washington, D.C. right now looking into President Trump's business dealings and whether he is profiting from some of his, because he did not fully divest himself from some of his business, his hotels and his other business dealings, whether or not he is, illegally profiting from the emoluments clause from some of these. So I think that's also important, that connection of politics and business.
That's right.
Memo.
That's right. That's right. And the document goes on to say that Cohen, however, did not follow up on this invitation. But think about how these things work, and this is something that I've looked into quite a bit. It's about compromise, having compromising information on someone. And so if you talk to U.S. intelligence officials, they will tell you that that's what the Russians do. That's how they operate. And in this dynamic, even though, according to this document, Cohen didn't follow up on this invitation, imagine if that information had gotten out.
But, Jeff, I want to point out that the memo says he didn't follow up on that invitation because, if you read below, it's because he was working on the Moscow project with a different individual who Cohen understood to have his own connections to the Russian government. So this is, Russian connection number 2, whom he was already speaking with, which is interesting because why is the memo focusing on that first individual and not the one who Cohen was actually dealing with? That might mean that they know more about that first Russian national.
Well, and they may. And again, you bring up another good point. This is just Michael Cohen. When you talk about some of the other contacts that people in the campaign had with Russian operatives or with Russian officials, you had George Papadopoulos, who had some meetings overseas. You had Michael Flynn, and obviously Paul Manafort through his business connections. And all of this was happening along that timeline leading up to the general election.
Right.
And to my earlier point, had this information gotten out, it's the kind of information that someone can hold over you if you are a candidate. And that's what compromise is. It is information that can be held over you and then used later to extract any type of information that may benefit the Russians down the road. And again, that's what this investigation is all about. Was there some sort of agreement that precipitated people in the campaign acting a certain way? For example, watering down the GOP platform before the GOP convention to benefit Russia in certain ways, which, at the time, many of us who were following this story and following that convention thought, well, that's odd. What just happened?
Right.
And so there were different occurrences along the campaign that raised some eyebrows and had people wondering, well, what is it about Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump? Because, of course, you had President Trump on the campaign trail praising Vladimir Putin. And people would say, well, why is he saying that? It just seems so odd. He was the only candidate at the time praising Vladimir Putin. And so those statements stood out.
Absolutely.
And so all of this is something that the special counsel's office and the FBI initially were looking into. What was happening leading up to the general election that may have caused these specific events to occur.
Bit by bit, we're getting more and more of what the special counsel may be zeroing in on. I want to bring in now Bob Litt. He is a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General and former General Counsel for the Director of National Intelligence. Bob, some have indicated that the timing of these developments are not coincidental. Do you get a sense that Mueller is reaching an endgame here?
It's very hard to tell what Mueller's timing is. One of the things that we've learned over the course of the year and a half that Mueller has been running this investigation is that we know what Mueller is going to do when he does it and not before. There still seem to be a lot of loose ends. The fact that portions of Flynn's memo were redacted and apparently portions of the Manafort memo are going to be redacted indicates that there are still active investigative matters that Mueller thinks needs to be protected. So it's really very hard to tell. He could be going into an endgame or he could simply be moving into a different phase of the investigation.
And so, Bob, on the matter of the Manafort memo, would Acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker have access to the unredacted document? And then could he then share that information with the president?
He would have access to it, I think. He should not share it with the president, but there's no law that would prevent him from sharing it.
So when you say he should not, is that an ethical consideration?
It's partly ethical, and it's partly defending the prerogatives of the Department of Justice. It's not typical under any circumstances to share these kinds of litigation documents with the White House, and certainly not in a situation where you might be sharing it with people who are implicated by the documents.
So, to your knowledge, is Matthew Whitaker getting involved in any way in the special counsel's office?
I don't know.
You don't know.
This is something that the Department of Justice has been very secretive about.
Caitlin, you look like you had something to say about that.
I just wanted to ask, this is Caitlin Huey-Burns, I just wanted to ask you if you could explain kind of what the significance of these two documents coming out at the same time are from the Southern District and from the special counsel's office, because they send two very different tones. So what is the implication of that?
Well, they're coming out at the same time because there are two separate criminal cases in which Manafort pleaded guilty in New York, and he's being sentenced on both. They're both before the same judge, and he's being sentenced on both on the same day. So both sentencing memoranda were due today for that reason. I don't think that the difference of tone is as remarkable as one might otherwise think, because they're very different cases. And I think that Mueller's office took great pains not to interfere with the Southern District's recommendation, and the Southern District took great pains not to interfere with Mueller's recommendation. Mueller says basically, if it was my case alone, this is what I would recommend, but it's not my case alone. But I do think that you should give credit for his cooperation in my case by making the sentences concurrent. The Southern District of New York says basically in our matter, Cohen did not cooperate fully. He did not tell us everything about his own criminal conduct, and therefore we don't think he deserves significant credit in this case.
Right. He talks about 4 separate and serious crimes over the course of several years, including willful tax evasion, making false statements to a financial institution, illegal campaign contributions, and making false statements to Congress. And they each involve deception, which the memo makes a point of pointing out. So, Bob, if you're reading between the lines here, what are you understanding about how valuable Cohen is to the Mueller investigation?
Well, he obviously, there are two areas reading between the lines of this that I think are significant. One is the interactions with Russia in 2015 and 2016. Jeff pointed out one interesting fact about the contact in November 2015. Earlier on, there's a footnote which talks about an incident in September of 2015 where Cohen suggested that Trump meet with Putin when Putin came to the UN General Assembly, and notes that Cohen told them that he had conferred with Trump about that before making that offer. So there's another little bit of information there. Entirely apart from the Russia thing, I think if you read between the lines here, another area that we know Mueller has been looking at is potential obstruction of justice by the president and others after the president took office. And if you look at the third and fourth points in Mueller's summary, they're rather vague and very pregnant. Third, Cohen provided relevant and useful information concerning his contacts with persons connected to the White House during the 2017-2018 time period. The persons aren't identified, the nature of the contacts isn't identified, but presumably those people know the contacts they had with Cohen. And fourth is, Cohen described the circumstances of preparing and circulating his response to the congressional inquiries while continuing to accept responsibility for the false statements contained within it. You note the word circulating there. That's an indication that before Cohen sent that letter to Congress, or before he went up and testified to Congress, he told people what he was going to say. And that is also a potentially significant point. Again, we don't know who he told. We don't know exactly what he said. But that, to me, is kind of a shot across somebody's bow that we know you knew Cohen was lying.
And also, when the memo, from the special prosecutor's office of the Southern District of New York, when that memo talked about the payments to the two women, it also talked about other people from the campaign coordinating or being aware of those payments. Is that significant?
Yes, although I have a recollection that may have been something that came out at the time of Cohen's plea, that there was a reference to communications with people in the campaign. I may be wrong on that. It's frequently, if you're not doing this full time, it's hard to keep all the information straight. But it's obviously significant to the extent that you're talking about campaign finance violations if people in the campaign were aware of those at the time.
Exactly. Exactly. And also, the footnote that describes the defendant, Michael Cohen, speaking with another Russian national with whom he assumed was connected to the Russian government about the Moscow project. Does that tell you anything about more people that were involved?
Well, there were obviously, the Russians seem to have been pursuing multiple channels on this. One of the interesting questions to me is if the first person, the Russian national who claimed to be a trusted person, if he was offering political synergy and synergy on a government level, as well as business assistance, and Cohen turned him down because he was working with another person, does that mean that he expected the same sort of synergy from the second person as well? Again, we don't know.
And why would the first person be the one mentioned in the memo and not the person with whom Cohen was already working? That's what I'm curious about.
Well, it may be that the conversation with the first person was more explicit than the conversation with the second person. We can do a lot of speculation, but only Bob Mueller knows what Mueller knows.
But you would have to assume that he was very careful about what information he released in this memo, correct, Bob?
Absolutely, absolutely. He releases things that he wants released, and he doesn't release things that he doesn't want released. So
every detail of Cohen's cooperation with the special counsel's office was gone over with a fine-toothed comb. I mean, they released just enough to make their point and no more.
Correct. That's exactly right.
So, and it is still new information for us. But does that then indicate to you that perhaps there will be more information coming out in the Manafort sentencing guideline, perhaps?
We don't know. We do know that the Manafort sentencing memorandum is going to be released in redacted form because there is certain material that Mueller does not want to put out on the public record. What we don't know is how much is going to be public and how much is going to be redacted. We'll just have to wait and see on that.
And one difference between Manafort and Cohen in terms of the level of cooperation. Remember that in September, when Manafort pleaded guilty, he struck a plea agreement and then violated that plea agreement in November. So he has not been as cooperative, at least from what we know in terms of public statements, as Cohen has been. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out from this filing.
Exactly. All right. So joining me now is Associated Press White House reporter Zeke Miller. He is also a CBSN political contributor. Zeke, thank you so much for being with us. The president was clearly irate this morning ahead of these documents. What do you see the White House reaction being now that the documents have been released?
Well, so far, we've heard radio silence from the president on this. We haven't seen a tweet yet. We haven't seen a statement from his attorneys, in part because they're waiting for this other shoe to drop. The Manafort filing says they don't want to. So they don't want to have to put two responses out. But the president was pretty clear about what he thinks about Michael Cohen over the last several weeks, and also what he thinks of the special counsel probe more broadly. So it really, whatever response we do get from them will probably not be much surprise. It'll be a lot more of the same.
So, Zeke, we also know, interestingly, that the president mentioned today he'd be filing a counter report to Mueller's eventual conclusion. I believe that's the first we've heard about a potential counter report. And What more do we know about that, and what's the strategy here?
We really haven't heard a lot about that from the president's legal team. We're hearing about it from the president, which is sort of an interesting factor, since that's one of the questions that all of us reporters have been asking the president's legal team for months now. What would they do to do in conjunction when Mueller does issue his final report? Would they somehow rebut? And the president saying not only are they, will they do that? They're already working on it. He tweeted that there are 87 pages already done. Obviously, this could be a very long report. There's a lot of information that's going to cover over a number of different subjects and a long period of time. So we don't quite know the shape of that. Is it going to be a critique of Mueller personally, like we've seen from the president over the last several months? Or will it try to be a counterpoint, sort of point-by-point rebuttal of the actual substance of the matter? That we don't know yet. That would sort of be the big question. Ultimately, the way the president and his legal team seem to be doing this is that this is a political matter, which would indicate that they are, that their rebuttal to Mueller might just be an indictment of the special counsel himself and their attempt to undermine his legitimacy rather than really addressing whatever substance he does reveal to the American people in the Justice Department.
Well, one thing that we are learning from the special counsel's office, the memo that was included in the sentencing guidelines, is more about this Moscow project, which is something that which has just kind of fairly recently come to light. It seems as if the president will be having to answer more questions about this. And again, that goes against what he had earlier said about his business dealings. He's had to sort of change his story somewhat on that. Has there been any indication what the White House will say about business dealings with Russia or anything that was going on in 2015 and early 2016?
Well, notably, I think we can expect to hear nothing from the White House on that front. From the president, we saw his initial tweets when those stories broke and when those filings were revealed, where the president said he essentially admitted that he was considering those deals but never actually followed through with them. The White House, as an institution, is trying to leave all of this, compartmentalize it to the president's outside legal counsel, and then the internal sort of Mueller liaison, who is Emmett Flood, but who is not sort of the president's attorney. He's the attorney in this matter for the executive office of the president. So this is the White House staff, and when you talk to them, they try to keep their hands clean. They don't want no part of this, because the way these things end up going, the more involved White House staffers get, the more legal jeopardy and exposure they bring for themselves. So they're trying to keep clean hands here.
And so, Zeke, do we know anything? Has there been any then release or indication from the press office? Will Sarah Huckabee Sanders be making any statements, do you think, today? Or will we not hear anything until potentially tomorrow?
Well, we know we won't see the president tonight. The White House issued what we call a travel photo lid, which means there won't be any images of the president tonight. He won't be leaving the White House campus. He's supposed to be hosting a dinner for his senior staff in the East Room this evening and their spouses, which will kick off around 7 or 7:30. I think the far more likely way we'll hear from this is not necessarily from Sarah, but certainly from tweets either from the president or others in his orbit over the next several hours.
All right, Zeke Miller, thank you so much. Stand by and stay with us, if you will. Caitlin, it will be interesting to see if the president is able to not tweet about this. My guess is he probably won't, but of course he is probably going to have to face more questions about those business dealings, especially now that it's clear that Michael Cohen was more involved in discussions about that Moscow tower than we perhaps previously knew.
That's right. And we've seen the president distance himself from Michael Cohen. And that's why I was asking the explanation for the difference between these two filings, because I think it's important for our viewers to know when the president does respond what he is going to be referring to. So there are crimes that Cohen did commit, and then there are these, according to the Mueller probe. And remember, the Mueller investigation involves anybody related to the president and potentially could involve the president. That's the big question that we have as we're going through these filings as they come out. And so we're also expected to get something from the Manafort filing today, too. And just to revisit kind of the relationship that the president has with both men. We've seen Manafort violate his plea agreement. We've also seen the president talk favorably about Manafort, even as he's distanced himself from him, saying, I didn't really know him that well. He only managed my campaign for a little bit. He was a center figure in the campaign, especially when it came to counting those delegates, as we know. But he has said that he's kind of gotten a bad shake. Cohen, he has talked very differently about. He has really thrown thrown Cohen under the bus. And now we know the extent to which Cohen has been cooperating with the special counsel, meeting 7 times here. And we don't know how much longer this will go.
And all of that meeting and all of that cooperating still doesn't look like it's going to save him from jail time.
Right.
Now,
right.
I just want to tell our viewers it is 6 o'clock here in the East. I'm Tanya Rivero. We want to bring you up to speed if you are just joining us. Special counsel Robert Mueller has issued a memo describing Michael Cohen's cooperation. Now, this comes ahead of Cohen's sentencing for crimes to which he has pleaded guilty. Mueller writes that after initially lying, Cohen eventually talked extensively about his Russian contacts during the 2016 presidential campaign when he worked for Donald Trump. Cohen says the Russians offered, quote, political synergy and synergy on a government level to then candidate Trump. He also talked about the president's business dealings with Russia during that time, including a massive development called the Moscow Project. Mueller does not make a sentencing recommendation for Cohen, but in a separate memo, New York prosecutors have said he should serve significant jail time for a separate case. That case involves a payoff to porn star Stormy Daniels. Cohen has testified the payoff was ordered by Mr. Trump just before the election. Prosecutors in that case recommend he serve at least 5 years in prison. The Mueller team is also putting out a sentencing memo on former Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort. That document is expected to be heavily redacted. Manafort is facing the rest of his life in prison for lying about millions he's accepted from Russia-linked organizations for services including influencing elections. CBS News Chief Justice and Homeland Security correspondent Jeff Pegues joins me now. Jeff, tell us again what stood out to you about these documents.
Well, it was the special counsel's document, which talked about this November 2015 meeting or this contact that Michael Cohen said that he had with a Russian national who claimed to be a trusted person in the Russian Federation who could offer the campaign political synergy and synergy on a government level. That, to me, stood out. And then later in this document, they talk about how Cohen provided relevant information and useful information concerning his contacts with persons connected in the White House during the in the White House, essentially, during the 2017 and 2018 time period. And that centers around his congressional testimony. Remember, he pleaded guilty to lying to Congress in its Russia investigation. And in this document, the special counsel says that he provided information about who he was talking to leading up to his congressional testimony. In other words, was he talking to someone in the White House who then gave him talking points, essentially, to tell members of Congress in their investigation, and then subsequently to lie to members of Congress? So, Tanya, those are the things that stand out to me. This is, obviously you outline there what's at stake in this investigation and the different aspects of all of these investigations. But in terms of the special counsel probe, the one looking into whether there was any type of coordination between the Trump campaign and Russian operatives, this is the information that stands out to me. Those early contacts in November of 2015, when Michael Cohen had this contact with this alleged trusted person who said that he or she was close to the Russian Federation.
I just want to point out, Jeff, that I believe that President Trump has just tweeted. He tweeted, "Totally clears the president. Thank you." I'm not quite sure what he's referring to, but perhaps it is the sentencing guideline. Yeah. Unclear exactly what he's referring to, but Caitlin, do you have thoughts on that tweet?
Well, it came out at 6 p.m. And so, we obviously just started our coverage. Here.
Interesting. I thought he wasn't going to tweet this evening. I was incorrect.
And he is referred to in these documents as individual one. And Jeff, I'm wondering if I could ask you, are there any clues here to show whether the president himself is implicated in any of this?
Well, there's nothing in here that says that he is implicated or in some sort of jeopardy, at least not in these documents. But the documents talk about how Cohen provided relevant and useful information concerning his contacts with persons connected to the White House during 2017 and 2018. Now, remember, Michael Cohen was close to President Trump. And in fact, in April, when Cohen's home office hotel room was raided, President Trump reached out to him. And so he was talking to the president and had contacts with the president, you know, even though he was under scrutiny by the special counsel's office and others, you know, in the Southern District of New York. And so, you know, even though the president in this tweet from 6 o'clock says that he's totally in the clear, I don't know what the exact tweet was, but that he's totally in the clear. That, you know, if you're in the White House representing this president and you're reading this document, you're concerned. You're concerned, especially when it says that Cohen outlined to investigators what kind of contacts he had with people in the White House.
I just want to point out that we also now have the Manafort document here. The government has released its case outlining all the ways in which Paul Manafort has lied and breached his agreement, breached his plea agreement by making false statements. I'm just going to read some of this. On September 14, 2018, Manafort pleaded guilty to a superseding information, charging him with 2 conspiracy counts that together encompassed all the criminal conduct alleged in the superseding indictment in this district. As the court is aware, that criminal conduct occurred for more than a decade and up through April 2018. Manafort's plea agreement required that he cooperate fully, truthfully, completely, and forthrightly with the government. They go on to then say how he breached that agreement. The defendant breached his plea agreement in numerous ways by lying to the FBI and special counsel's office. The principal lies relate to, among other things, 1, Manafort's interactions with Konstantin Kilimink's participation in count 2 of the superseding information, a wire transfer to a firm that was working for Manafort, information pertinent to another Department of Justice investigation, and Manafort's contact with administration officials. And we briefly set forth each in turn. So on count number 1, but it's heavily redacted. I wanted to read through this, but it's so redacted that you can't complete a sentence. Manafort falsely told investigators that after redacted, in fact, Manafort redacted. The evidence of the above includes electronic communications, including detailed descriptions, redacted, and travel records. After being told of such evidence, Manafort conceded that he and Kilimnik discussed or may have discussed redacted at each meeting. So point number 1 is almost entirely redacted. Point number 2, I can read. Kilimink's role in the obstruction conspiracy. After signing the plea agreement, Manafort denied that Kilimnik was part of a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice by reaching out to 2 witnesses to tailor their testimony to a false narrative that would exculpate them of a Foreign Agents Registration Act violation. Yet on September 14, 2018, Manafort pleaded guilty to count 2 of the superseding information, charging him with conspiring with Kilimnik to obstruct justice between February and April 2018 by trying to influence the testimony of the 2 witnesses. Page 8, I'm going to jump ahead to a section that is not redacted. Page 8. Point number 5, contact with the administration. After signing the plea agreement, Manafort stated he had no direct or indirect communications with anyone in the administration while they were in the administration, and that he never asked anyone to try to communicate a message to anyone in the administration on any subject matter. Manafort stated that he spoke with certain individuals before they worked for the administration or after they left the administration. The evidence demonstrates that Manafort lied about his contacts. The evidence demonstrates that Manafort had contacts with administration officials. For instance, in a text exchange from May 26, 2018, Manafort authorized a person to speak with an administration official on Manafort's behalf. separately, according to another Manafort colleague. Manafort said in February 2018 that Manafort had been in communication with a senior administration official up through February 2018. A review of documents recovered from a search of Manafort's electronic documents demonstrates additional contacts with administration officials. So, Jeff, you know, we can't read it all. A lot of it is redacted, but clearly there they found clear evidence, texts, emails, evidence of communication with administration officials after Manafort had clearly stated he had no communication.
You know, I'm going to say this again, Tanya. You did a great job with that, because this is not, you know, this is a complicated case. And these are lengthy documents. And as you point out, a lot of it is redacted. But you mentioned, you know, not only the contacts with administration officials, that is important. And so as the president sends out this tweet this evening, perhaps he didn't get to page 9 of this Manafort document. I mean, this is important stuff in the overall investigation. And so why is Paul Manafort reaching out to people in the administration? Why does he, according to investigators, lie whenever it has to deal with this guy, Konstantin Kilimnik? His name is Konstantin Kilimnik, Kostya Kilimnik for short. He is someone whose name frequently comes up when it comes to Paul Manafort, and here's why. He is a business associate for Paul Manafort. When he was doing a lot of work in the Ukraine, he would turn to Kostya Kilimnik to translate for him, to work with him in dealing with these Russian oligarchs or anyone connected to the Kremlin. And that's why it is so puzzling for those of us who follow this investigation that, you know, every time he seems to get in trouble with the special counsel's office. There was a witness tampering allegation, I think it was last summer or so, and that also involved Kostya Kilimnik. Kilimnik, by the way, has been named in an indictment as well. And so he is a prominent figure in Paul Manafort's life. So that's an important revelation here, as investigators in the special counsel's office outline what they say Paul Manafort has been lying about. And again, Tanya, to your point, these contacts with the administration, not in 2017, but in 2018, as he is under scrutiny by the special counsel's office, and also while he's in this agreement to cooperate with the special counsel.
Jeff, it's Caitlin. Just a quick point to take our readers through, because Manafort's legal troubles have been in the news for several months now, and there have been a couple of different cases. Could you just remind our viewers what this case specifically is that we're looking at, compared to the ones in Virginia, for example?
Well, sure. He faced, you know, in a case in Virginia, found guilty in that case. And then there was a second case here in D.C. In which he came to an agreement with prosecutors in that he would plead guilty. And in exchange for that guilty plea, he would cooperate with the special counsel's investigation. And so that's what this is about. His cooperation with the special counsel's office. And by the way, he was cooperating so that he would, you know, this would be a credit toward sentencing, because you know, that's what he was. That was part of this agreement. And so when we heard that this agreement had sort of fallen apart because investigators accused him of lying, and then we found out that there had remained in place this agreement between the attorneys in the White House representing the president, and also Manafort's attorneys, to share information. And that's why that revelation in this latest Manafort document is so important. It is a lot to keep track of. You know, what has spawned from the original basis of the Russia investigation are several different branches of investigations, not only involving Michael Flynn and his dealings with Turkey, but also Paul Manafort and his dealings with oligarchs like Oleg Deripaska, one of the richest men in Russia. And so there are several different aspects of this investigation, and that's what we're trying to keep track of right now.
One more thing to keep track of, who's even on the desk. It's me, Brooke Silva Braga, in for Tanya Rivero, as we now roll into our second hour of coverage of these memos. Bob Litt, I believe you're still in Washington. And as we look through these 5 areas where the special counsel says Paul Manafort misled them, one is contact with the administration, and especially in light of the tweet the president sent out about 15 minutes ago saying that today's documents clear him. What do you make of the special counsel pointing out that Manafort lied and had contacts with the administration?
Well, I think the president's tweet that he's totally cleared is a little bit of the same nature as his statement that his inauguration crowd was the largest in history. I think it's a bit of wishful thinking on his part and maybe a bit of an effort to work the ref on this. I think it's very interesting that although this document is very heavily redacted, Mueller did not redact any of the information relating to contacts between Manafort and the administration. And this matches up with what is said in the sentencing memoranda about Michael Cohen, too, where it makes a point of talking about contacts with people in the White House. The people who were contacted know what those communications were. And while Mueller didn't spell it out, this text exchange from May 26, 2018, that's in between the time when Manafort was indicted and when his trial began. It would be very interesting to go back and find out what was going on in Manafort's trial at that time, because the question that immediately comes to mind was Manafort trying to contact somebody in the White House to scope out the possibility of a pardon if he hung tough and went to trial? So I think that Mueller is sending a message here that he knows about the communications that people in the campaign and people in the White House and people close to the president had with Cohen and Manafort. And if those communications were, in fact, criminal or obstructive in any way, the people who had those communications need to worry.
Jesse Weber is another fresh face here at our set, attorney and host at the Law and Crime Network. Jesse, give us your first impressions of these memos.
Well, it's what we expected. A lot of it we're just not going to know about. A lot of it has been redacted and blacked out. Only the parties and the judge will have access to the full information about what Paul Manafort allegedly lied about. When I first looked at it, I tried to find any connection to the 2016 presidential election. It's hard to glean from that how you can make the connection. What I seem to suggest, and what I suggested earlier, is that if you're Robert Mueller, you are building a case, and this is a stumble for you because one of the blocks that you used to build that case is now not so credible. And it's Paul Manafort we were all expecting was going to be a key part of Robert Mueller's investigation. And now, if you're looking at 5 key areas where he was untruthful, what else do you have to look at and say, well, maybe he's not a reliable source?
Another way to look at it, though, is that the special counsel is able to call nonsense on Manafort's testimony. The same case could be made about Flynn, because you made this point that it's a bad sign that a witness like Flynn is not telling them the truth. They have to come back to square one. Is it not also a good sign?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because when the Flynn information came out this week, one of the first questions I had was, well, there's such strength to that sentencing memo, and when you see that he provided substantial assistance, my first reaction was, well, they clearly have backed up his claims and what they told him. And at first, I didn't think Cohen was going to get the same kind of sentencing treatment as Flynn did. And so when I looked at that and I said, okay, they really find him to be credible. When you look at Manafort, like you said, they're not just playing games here.
Rebecca Roy Fee is on the phone with us. She's a professor of law at New York Law School and a former assistant district attorney in the New York County District Attorney's Office. We got really 2 starkly different memos with Cohen, with the Southern District of New York taking a much harder line than the special counsel's office. What did you make of that?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think both special counsel and the Southern District both think that that Cohen wasn't entirely truthful and Cohen wasn't willing to own up to all of the crimes he's committed, and that explains something people have been puzzled about, why he didn't get an actual cooperation agreement. So that is a puzzle that's been answered. The second thing I think is interesting about the Southern District's submission is that they really lay out very clearly what had been implicit in the plea, which is that individual one, who I think everybody knows is President Trump.
At what point they describe
Cohen.
individual one as going on to win the U.S. presidency? So I think it's not
so
very
it's very
gray.
clear. Right, no mystery anymore. And they clearly say that he directed Cohen to make these payments, which means that the only thing that's left to prove is his intent. Other than that, they've basically just stated that he committed a felony. So
the president, to be clear, you're saying the president.
The president has committed a felony. Now,
and the felony is a campaign finance violation?
Campaign finance violation. Now, to be clear, he could still claim that he didn't have the requisite state of mind. He didn't do it willfully. But, I mean, it's pretty shocking, I think, that that's in there.
And with all these lawyers on the panel, I feel like if we're going to say the president committed a felony or he's being accused of a felony in these documents, we, I think, then need to have the conversation of whether a sitting president can be tried for crimes committed before he took office while he's in office. And I'll let you take the first crack at that if you'd like, Rebecca.
Well, first, I'd just like to say, what does the Southern District do with this fact? I mean, if they know somebody has committed a felony and have stated it in a public filing, it's a very odd thing just to leave it there. And, I mean, when you as a prosecutor know somebody has committed a crime, you have an obligation to follow up on that. So that's a really weird thing to dangle out there like that. Second of all, in terms of whether you can indict a sitting president, I mean, I think the Department of Justice guidelines are going to prevail here. And I don't think they're actually, I don't think they analyze the law accurately, but what they do say is that a sitting president can't be indicted. So my guess is that neither Mueller nor the Southern District of New York is going to indict President Trump, but that fact is there. And once it's combined with all of these other mysterious pieces that you guys have been talking about so well, that's, you know, then we'll know what will happen next.
Those are some big statements. Bob Litt, if you're still there, I'd be interested in your take on whether this document, number one, suggests the president committed a felony, and number two, it's right that even if he did, he will not be indicted.
Well, I think you and Rebecca accurately identified the issue here. The document certainly suggests that the president was aware that payments were being made on his behalf, that the Southern District of New York alleged and that Michael Cohen admitted constituted a violation of the campaign finance laws. From the point of view of the culpability of the president, first of all, I think if there were a trial in this case, the president would deny that, in fact, it is a violation of the campaign finance laws under these circumstances. It's not a clear-cut case because it's not, you know, a direct contribution to the campaign. But more
remind us
importantly,
what the standard is. If there is a clear one.
There are limits on the amount that any individual can contribute to a campaign. And if you surpass those limits, you are violating the campaign finance law. And if you do it willfully, which means you are knowing that it violates the law and intending to violate the law, it can be a crime. And that would be, I think, the president's second defense, which is to say, well, even if this is a violation of the law, I didn't do it knowing and intending to violate the campaign finance law. I just did it to cover up the fact that I had an affair. And this was similar to the defense that John Edwards used when he was prosecuted for something that sounded very similar, and he was, in fact, acquitted by a jury. The third point to make, though, which I think is the critical one, I think Rebecca's absolutely right. Bob Mueller is bound to follow Department of Justice policy, and Department of Justice policy is that a sitting president can't be indicted for any conduct whatsoever, whether it's conduct before or during his presidency. And I think Mueller is likely to follow that, as is the Southern District.
And what then, Bob, does that mean for this investigation? What is Bob Mueller's endgame if he indeed believes that the ultimate head of the organization he's investigating is beyond the scope of his investigation?
Well, you know, there are two issues. Number one, are there other individuals who are potentially culpable? And remember that the investigation of the payments to the women is not part of Mueller's investigation. That's being handled by the Southern District of New York because Mueller apparently did not feel that it fell within what he was authorized to do. So the decisions about that investigation as a criminal matter are going to be made by the Southern District of New York. Whether or not Mueller folds them into any report he makes is a separate matter, but they're not within the scope of his investigation.
And Caitlin, a sitting president, may not be able to be indicted, in part because we have a whole nother process, right? I'll use the I word, impeachment. If there is a case of what Rebecca's describing, the felony of campaign finance violations, is there a practical, is that something that Washington cares enough about? A relatively divided Congress in both chambers, the Senate still held by Republicans. You would need a two-third vote in the Senate. So you're talking about like 20 Republicans in addition to all the Democrats. Is the I word worth discussing on a day where maybe the president is accused of these crimes?
Well, certainly Democrats on the candidate level, while we saw during the midterm campaigns, were kind of reluctant to talk about it. And we've also heard that Democrats in Congress have also been trying to play a very cautious line here because we really didn't have any information yet about what Mueller has been finding. We're seeing it through these filings. But I think it's important to note that politically, things change come January because the House will be controlled by Democrats. That's different now. So we have the Mueller investigation. We could see Democrats expand this investigation and try to make further probes about the president and his involvement. So we'll certainly see an interest in expanding this investigation. And Democrats feel after the election that there hasn't been enough substantial accountability of this president, given that Republicans have been in control of Washington during his first 2 years.
Jesse, I want to go back to Michael Cohen for a minute. The special counsel does not give a recommendation on sentencing, but they do say there are these two different cases, and at least we recommend that they should be served concurrently. Is that good news for Cohen?
It is, because you don't want it to be consecutive, but we can't forget the fact that he is talking about 8 federal crimes and lying to Congress. And what they're basically saying is, okay, take that one charge that he pled guilty to and have that sentence just be served at the same time that he's serving the ultimate sentence. Now, the guidelines here would suggest anywhere between 4 and 5 years in prison. And what we just saw from the memo that was released, it looks like he might be serving closer to that. Now, what they said was you can have some variance to that. We recommend some variance, maybe take a year off, shed 2 years, maybe that. But again, this is not so significant. I think he had to have expected this as it keeps being brought up. He didn't have a cooperation agreement and he didn't provide as many details as Mr. Flynn did right at the very beginning. If Cohen was forthcoming at the very beginning, it might have been a different situation.
Are these type of recommendations usually adopted by the judge?
They're definitely considered, and especially in cases like this. But it was the same conversation we had at the beginning of the week when the Flynn sentencing memo came out. Just because that is a recommendation doesn't mean the judge will ultimately follow it. But especially in a cooperation agreement where you saw it in the Flynn case, is the judge can either take that recommendation and go exactly towards it or, impose a sentence. I've seen sentences before where someone would have a mandatory life in prison and yet they're given probation or parole. And so there's a different kinds of situation there. But here from Mr. Cohen, it doesn't look so good as it did for Mr. Flynn.
Rebecca, if you're still on the phone, I'm curious, the question that I put to Bob Litt about where this investigation goes if it does not go all the way up to that man, Donald Trump. What do you see as the end game for this investigation?
I think that there's going to be a report. I think it's going to name everybody who's involved. I think that the idea is to get this information to the American people at this point and to have it be resolved in a political way. So I don't know. I don't think that the campaign finance issue on its own would be enough. And I think that's part of the reason why Mueller spun that off to the Southern District of New York. But I think we have all of these little pieces that need to be connected. And once they're connected, we need to know whether or not they implicate the president or they implicate anybody close to him. If they implicate somebody close to him, those people are going to be indicted. And he will be, if he's involved, he will be named as an unindicted co-conspirator, and then it will be turned over to the political process.
Rebecca, I think it's confusing to a lot of people why these investigations are split between New York and the special counsel's office. Can you explain how that division works?
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, I just think that Mueller was being extremely careful because he has a very specific mandate, and because he's been so attacked and so challenged in public, he's trying to keep well within the line. So I think he could have kept that case. I think it's related enough to the core of what he was investigating to be relevant and to be appropriate. But I think he spun it off in part just so that it could be clear that this is a criminal case being taken by somebody else, by some other part of the Department of Justice, and it's therefore distinct from what he's working on, and then he can continue his investigation. A second reason, I think, is also to get as much information as he can into other places within the Department of Justice and before judges, because the more becomes public and the more that goes to judges, the less possibility there is, if there is an effort to bury that information, that it will ever happen. You can't bury information once it's in the judge's hands, and it's harder to bury once it's in the Southern District of New York than if it's being held by Mueller, because Mueller's position is, as you guys all know, so controversial.
And we know that while the version of the memo we have is heavily redacted, the judge has an unredacted version. Rebecca, it's an unfair question we ask everyone, and why spare you? Where are we in this game? Is this halftime? Are we in the fourth quarter? How far along in this odyssey are we?
You know, I thought before the Flynn filing came out that we were nearing the end, and I have grown to believe that we're not quite there yet, and that's partially because of all the redacted material. The redacted material tends to show that there are ongoing investigations, and that those investigations, it's just really impossible to know what stage they're in. They may be nearing the end, but they may not. And it does seem like a complex web of facts to put together.
Bob, on the point of redactions, you pointed out earlier that that fifth bullet point, contact between Manafort and the administration, entirely unredacted. The other ones, much more heavily redacted. Can you make anything out from those redactions? Do they raise any? What are the questions you ask when you see those redactions in the other parts of the Manafort memo? And Bob Litt, that was for you, if you're still there and you heard my question.
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, yes.
Okay. The first question that it raises in my mind is I'd sure like to know what's underneath the redactions.
Well, yes, even I can do that.
You know, obviously, a lot of this seems to relate to Manafort's own financial dealings and his relationship with Kostya Kalimnik, who, it's important to note, was not only a business associate of his, but was also associated with Russian intelligence, which adds another level of interest to this. But again, I think that to me, the interesting part from the point of view of where the Mueller investigation is going is the section about contacts with the administration and what that says about the possible obstruction of justice investigation. Was Manafort reaching out to see if he could get a promise of a pardon? And if so, what answer was made to him? And that's a question that I'd really like to know the answer to.
Jesse? Have you had a chance to look at these redactions, and do you make any take anything from them?
To be completely honest, I saw it 5 minutes before I came. But what I did,
this is where we all are. We have a bunch of papers in front of us, and we're trying to make sense of them.
The first thing that I was looking at, of course, is how does this tie to the ultimate outcome that we're looking at? And as has been said, is it really seems to be more focused on his own personal dealings. But what I wanted to know most importantly, and I'm not sure if we got a full sense of it, what I thought we were going to see is what information he had about the Trump Tower meeting. I really was curious about that, because some reports were coming in that he didn't provide the information that Robert Mueller's team was really looking for about Trump's involvement, about President Trump's involvement and knowledge about that meeting, as well as Don Jr. And I was waiting to see that. I didn't quite see that. Now, it might be under all of those black lines somewhere that we just don't see. But what I'm very curious about is clearly, they are very upset. Clearly, they said, you want to challenge this? Come at us. We will have more evidence for you. So they really did not take lightly to him providing false information.
And why don't I, just as a reset, outline those 5 bullet points that are scrolling heavily redactedly down your screen. And these are the 5 things that the special counsel says Paul Manafort lied about under oath. Number 1, his interactions with Konstantin Kalimnik. Number 2, Kalimnik's role in the obstruction conspiracy. conspiracy, basically saying that Manafort gave him a call after speaking to investigators and said, hey, let's get on the same page, and maybe even talk to some other folks about how we can all spin an untrue story. Number 3, payment to a firm working for Manafort, $125,000 payment that went through some shell companies and was not as Manafort described. Number 4, a second DOJ investigation, and this is a beautiful redaction, just like, you know, an inch and a half in the paragraph that just steals you of all understanding of what's going on. Manafort provided information about redacted that was pertinent to an investigation in another district. And then the 5th point, as we've discussed, Manafort's contact with the administration, again, apparently to get on the same page. Rebecca Rofi, before we lose you on the phone, what are your next questions or next steps, or where do you think, whether we're at halftime or the 4th quarter, where are we headed next?
I think the big question mark right now in my mind is what happens with Roger Stone. I think that that's been hovering for a while, and I imagine that we're going to learn more about that and Julian Assange and what the intersection between that whole story and Mueller's investigation is. So I want to know that. I also, like you guys, really want to know what's under those redactions, and especially what this other DOJ investigation is that's totally redacted. So in addition to the contacts with the administration officials, which goes to the question of obstruction, there seems to be some other DOJ investigation that's ongoing, and there were hints of that in the Flynn filing, too. So I'm curious about what that might be.
Okay, Law Professor Rebecca Roifi, thanks so much for your time. I know you have to go. The rest of our cast of characters remain. And let's do a quick reset. If you're just tuning in and you see this document floating on your screen, what's going on? Well, these are memos from Special Counsel Robert Mueller detailing what he says are lies told by former one-time Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort, detailing why he should come in for a harsh sentence. And then just about an hour before that was released, we received or became public 2 memos at 5 o'clock this afternoon, one from the Southern District of New York, the other from the Special Counsel's office on the case of Michael Cohen, who next week will be sentenced. And the Southern District of New York took a hard line, saying because he has not fully cooperated, Michael Cohen should serve several years in jail. The Special Counsel's office did not give a sentencing recommendation, but did say that to an extent Cohen has helped them in their investigative work. Caitlin Huey-Burns, this is a drip, drip, drip story that continues. What do these drips mean to the political aspect of this saga? Well,
we saw the president tweet out tonight, right at 6 o'clock, that he's exonerated, that thank you, it's done. That is not true, and that is not clear from what we know. What's very interesting about Manafort, let's kind of revisit all the roles that these folks have played in the president's life. Because again, the big question that we still have is what the president's connection is, whether he's implicated in any of this, what his involvement really was in all of this, right? So Manafort, remember, back in September, he violated a plea, he agreed to a plea agreement, and then in November, he violated that plea agreement. He's lied about several things, and the question, or the theme, I should say, with a lot of these associates of the president is the lying. That's what a lot of these folks have gotten in trouble for. Remember, that was what Michael Flynn got in trouble for in the beginning. So, but when we're talking about Michael Cohen, who these sentencing guidelines also came down today, or you know, the president has really thrown him under the bus. He is done with Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen has shown that he is cooperating fully with the special counsel, meeting with Mueller 7 times, as we saw in these filings. The president, though, has talked pretty favorably about Manafort, even as he's tried to separate himself from Manafort. He's said that he's kind of gotten a bad deal out of all of this. So he's shown a little bit of sympathy toward Manafort, which of course raises the question of whether there is a pardon coming down the pike. That's the question we had when he violated that plea agreement. So still, to your point about the drip, 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 how incremental this whole thing is and how confusing it has been for the general public, the president has really seized on that, and he's tried to downplay this investigation, diminish it entirely, dismiss it as nothing but a witch hunt, and we've seen that start to have some effect in the polling, at least.
given the fact that the president has said, Cohen, he's no longer on my team. Cohen himself has said, I have to do what's best for my family, suggesting that he was saving his own hide rather than defending the president. I found it a little surprising, Jesse, and I wonder if you did, that the Southern District of New York memo went out of its way to say that Cohen was not a true cooperating witness.
Yeah, they said don't call him a hero, and it's in stark contrast to what we saw at the beginning of the week with Flynn, who I kept saying do not expect that Cohen is going to get the same recommended treatment as Flynn because he wasn't as forthcoming and was not as so quick to be as forthcoming. He only came forward with information not to benefit the government or the people at large, but to save himself, and that is something that is a factor that was heavily talked about in that memo. And when you see this, they said, look, we can't discount the fact he provided information to the special counsel's office. You can read their memo that he provided assistance. But when we had all these other investigations happening here in our jurisdiction, he didn't provide the kind of information, the full, complete information that we needed, which would have made him a cooperating witness in other kinds of circumstances. So he does not get the same kind of treatment as a cooperating witness.
Bob Litt in D.C., we've been talking about this circle around the president and different fates for different characters. Is there a next shoe that you wonder will fall, or a next character that you expect to enter the stage here?
Well, what's been lost in the events of this week having to do with Flynn, Manafort, and Cohen is last week's news, which was Jerome Corsi and Roger Stone, and that's still hanging fire out there. We don't know where that is going. Corsi said he expected to be indicted. Stone certainly has made noises as if he expects to be indicted. So that's a whole other area of the investigation that we're waiting to see what happens in.
Okay. At the White House is CBS News White House correspondent Weijia Jiang. And Weijia, I wonder what we're hearing from the White House this evening.
With regard to William Barr?
We've been discussing the sentencing memos that went to both, or in reference to both Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen. And we've noted the president's one tweet saying they essentially exonerate him. Beyond that tweet, have we heard anything from the building behind you?
Forgive me, sorry, I joined you late, but no. Actually, the president speaks for himself, and when it comes to this, often the White House actually always refers us to his outside counsel and to the president himself, and he certainly has made clear how he feels. And even though this was a week of mourning for President Trump and he reined it in, there were days also this very week in which he expressed his frustration over and over with the Russia investigation. He called special counsel Robert Mueller an out-of-control prosecutor. He already chimed in about his former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, and this is just another opportunity for him to try to discredit the investigation and say that these memos actually play in his favor because they do not reveal his wrongdoing in any part.
Weijia, thanks for the time. Sorry about the confusion. I know you just had to do evening news. We're going to go across town to the Justice Department where Paula Reed is standing by. I'm sorry, Paula Reed will be with us momentarily. Jesse Waters is here now.
Weber.
Well, you know,
we can't have two JWs in media. It's a problem. There can only be one.
Jesse Weber. We've been asking this kind of next steps question.
Sure.
What are the next steps you're wondering about?
So, great question you brought up before, right? Will the Mueller indict the president? That is not going to happen. That would be a fight that would go right to the Supreme Court. It would be a messy situation. Here's what I think is a practical aspect. He's going to come out with a report. That report will be submitted by whoever the Attorney General ultimately turns out to be to Congress. Congress will have to sit in there and think about what to do. Will they go to the House for articles of impeachment and then move on to the Senate for ultimate removal? That is a lot of ifs. We can't throw away that I word, impeachment, as you said, without thinking about the practical aspect of that. Now, if it gets to the point where he was actually removed from office, which again, I'm not sure I ever see happening, then the question becomes, do those charges get brought up again? And that is a lot of ifs. But what we can expect is that he will come out with a report. And I can promise you, when that day comes, the news cycle will be something to watch, because everybody's going to be pinpointing that report to see what's in it and what he ultimately found. And people are going to be happy about it, and people are going to be disappointed in it. Just because this investigation has been going on for such a long time, do not expect it to have the smoking gun that everybody wants. You will have a lot of information, and that is what every one of these filings and every one of these indictments is. It's getting more information to get a complete picture.
Paula Reed now joins us from outside the Justice Department, I understand. Paula, for you, what's the headline from these Mueller memos?
Well, these were much more newsy than we expected. I mean, what we see here is that while the special counsel and federal prosecutors are grateful for Cohen's help, they still believe that he should face substantial jail time. And it was interesting to see how they characterize his crimes, arguing that he's someone who tried to undermine core institutions of our democracy for personal profit. It was also interesting to see specifically what he has pleaded to, including the revelation of these contacts with the Trump campaign as early as November 2015 with some Russians who were seeking political synergy. That, of course, gets to the core of this investigation about questions about any conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. As for Mr. Manafort, we knew that he had lied. We didn't know specifically what he had lied to the special counsel about. Now we're getting more details about that. And I think the newest, sort of most surprising thing is that he was lying to the special counsel about his contacts with Trump administration officials as recently as May of this year. And of course, the big question is, well, why was he trying to conceal his contacts with the administration?
And there's this curious thing that remains in these memos where the president is individual one. Remind us why.
That's right. So when it was revealed that Cohen was cooperating with special counsel but would also be charged, he said that he had testified that he had discussed with both the president, who at times is sometimes referred to individual as individual one. Sometimes, though, for example, in Cohen's statement in court, he referred to the president as the president. He revealed that he had discussed the Trump Tower Moscow project with the president and members of his family during the campaign as late as June 2016. So, some people are sort of sarcastically referring to the president now as individual one. But the fact is, during that Cohen case, they did confirm. Cohen said individual one is the president.
And we've been asking this next steps question. What are the next steps in this investigation?
Well, I think there's a lot of speculation that this will be wrapping up soon. People see this flurry of activity, but that's just not true. Paul Manafort will not be sentenced until February, and also he'll be sentenced again in March. We know from our sources that witnesses continue to go before the grand jury to testify against Roger Stone. We do expect Stone will likely be charged in this case. We also expect Jerome Corsi. We know that his lawyers are in touch with the special counsel about a possible plea deal. They can't reach a deal, he's also going to be charged. And the special counsel continues to exist until everyone who's been charged has been fully adjudicated. So anyone who thinks that the special counsel is going to wrap up in the next few weeks, I mean, the facts of this case just do not support that.
Okay, Paula Reed outside the Department of Justice. Thanks a lot, Paula. CBS News Chief Justice and Homeland Security correspondent Jeff Begays joins us from the Bureau. Jeff, what stood out for you about these documents?
I think looking through the Cohen special counsel's office sentencing memo and then looking through the Manafort document, there's a thread there that I find interesting, and that is this contact with administration officials. Of course, Cohen pled guilty to lying to Congress, and what the special counsel's office says is that before his testimony before Congress, there was some contact with White House officials, and so here's one question that I have. Was there the type of contact where someone in the White House was giving Cohen talking points essentially for his testimony? And also then in the Manafort document, one reason why this agreement with the special counsel's office is essentially fallen apart is because of Manafort's contact with administration officials. And so I think that's a thread there. And then another morsel of information that the special counsel's office is revealing which will now lead to questions, and tough questions, I think, for this administration. You know, what kind of contacts did they have? What were the nature of those contacts with both Cohen and Manafort? Were they coaching them to present a certain narrative? You know, and I think that is one thing that I get from both of these documents from the special counsel's office as they relate to Michael Cohen, the president's former personal attorney, and Paul Manafort, the president's former campaign chairman.
Jeff, as a justice correspondent, I wouldn't normally ask you a political question, but this is a political question specifically related to the Justice Department. And it is, we have this new attorney general who the president will be nominating in William Barr. And there's always the possibility that he could take a different view of the legitimacy of this special counsel investigation. And so there's been some discussion in our last 2 hours discussing these memos that one thing the special counsel could be doing is just trying to get more paper into streams of the government beyond the scope of the president and even the Justice Department. So my question to you, somewhat political and somewhat speculative in nature, is does the Justice Department, do they feel this is a safe investigation, or might there be cause for people trying to move things into some official channel before something could change with a new attorney general?
Well, I mean, throughout this investigation, there has been this concern that the president would, through whatever means, fire the special counsel, therefore derailing the investigation. So I think that has been a concern, especially among Democrats in Congress, throughout this special counsel investigation, which is not quite nearly 2 years old, but it's coming up on 2 years old in May. But what the special counsel has done as he puts this picture together, this picture of his investigation together, is provide clues to what will eventually be this report. It sounds like, based on the president's tweets this morning, that he is expecting some sort of report to be presented to the Department of Justice and then, we think, to members of Congress. But this is a report that, you know, based on Mueller's history as the FBI director, a skilled prosecutor, it will be a complete report that will be understandable. I mean, we're getting a lot of different pieces tonight, and it can be confusing. But the core of this investigation is whether the Trump campaign conspired with Russian operatives. And it's hard to remember sometimes what this started out as, but that is the core of this investigation. And that is what the special counsel, Robert Mueller, that's the question he's trying to answer.
Well, special counsel's spiral, as we've seen through history. Bob Litt, the former Deputy Assistant Attorney General and a former General Counselor for the Director of National Intelligence, is also in Washington. And Bob, I want to put a similar question to you. If you're Bob Mueller, do you have any concerns for kind of the safety of your investigation going forward?
Well, we don't know what conversations Mueller may have had with Rod Rosenstein and, more importantly, with Mark Whitaker about this. Obviously, you have a very volatile president. He makes a lot of threats that he hasn't carried through on so far. But I would think that Mueller is, on the one hand, being very careful to gather all the evidence he can. But on the other hand, he's not going to take any extraordinary or unusual steps because he's very much a by-the-book guy. It's important to remember that even if Mueller gets shut down, all of the evidence and the information that he's gathered remains. Mueller was appointed as a special prosecutor. There are two separate steps. Number one, does Mueller conduct the investigation? Number two, does the investigation get shut down? And even if Mueller gets fired, it would require quite a remarkable step for the Department of Justice to say, not only are we going to get rid of Bob Mueller, but we're going to no longer pursue these investigations at all. I think if they did that, they would have a real internal rebellion on their hands.
William Barr, most likely the next Attorney General, an establishment figure, the Attorney General during George H.W. Bush's administration. The initial response to him seemed to be, okay, this isn't an extreme pick. The investigation will be fine. And then there seemed to be this wave led by Democrats, maybe left-leaning Democrats, saying, oh, no, I don't trust this guy. What's your impression of this selection?
So I think that I don't know Bill Barr personally. I served in the Justice Department after his time. I think he has a reputation as a responsible person who is, number one, who is sensitive to the prerogatives and the interests of the Department of Justice. Number two, having come up through the ranks at the Department of Justice. He was an assistant attorney general and then the deputy attorney general and then the attorney general. I don't think he's going to view the career people in the Department of Justice as enemies. Number three, Bob Mueller was an assistant attorney general working under him. So he knows Bob Mueller and he knows what Mueller is. So I think some of the people are concerned about some of the statements that Barr has made about the Clintons and about the Mueller investigation. I think it's very different to make those statements when you're on the outside and then to actually be in charge of an investigation when you're on the inside. And I suspect that Bill Barr will probably handle this in a professional and responsible manner.
And the other one was that he said he thought it was okay to fire James Comey as FBI director. That was one that concerned some. It sounds like it doesn't concern you.
Well, there are quite a number of people who felt that Comey deserved to be fired, just not in this way and for the reasons that the president gave. And so I don't think he's necessarily outside of the mainstream there. There are people who felt that Comey should not have taken on himself the responsibility for making an announcement as to the decision in a criminal investigation that wasn't his ultimate decision to make. And I think that's what Barr said.
Jeff Begay is on the other side of that Washington newsroom. What are the next questions you're trying to get answered, or at least wondering as you go home tonight?
Well, well, there's several, frankly, but Roger
We have time.
Stone,
We've got nothing but time, Jeff.
We do, right? But I won't bore you with all the questions that I have. But no, Roger Stone is someone whose name is still out there. And, what is next in terms of the special counsel investigation as it relates to him?
Yeah, wait, let's linger on that for a second. We haven't said Roger Stone's name in at least a couple days. That's another big shoe, right?
Well, in a way it is. Investigators have been talking to people around him, interviewing people around him. He has been defiant. He is someone who is close to the president, or at least considers himself close to the president, and says that, he won't flip like Michael Cohen. And so what is next for Roger Stone? But also these questions about, who was involved in these conversations with Michael Cohen before he testified, and who was having the contact with Paul Manafort, and were they getting marching orders from the White House?
Are we still really interested about this June meeting with the Russian lawyer at Trump Tower? Do we still think that's a centerpiece?
Oh, yeah, that is an important part of this investigation, and here's why. Around the time of that meeting, or just weeks after, is when the stolen Democratic Party emails started leaking out. So that is an important aspect of this investigation as you look at the timeline. Also, it was shortly before the GOP convention in Cleveland, and the GOP platform was changed, some say watered down, to favor Russia. And it was one of those points where people were wondering, well, who authorized that? And no, everybody was pointing the finger at somebody else. No one wanted to take responsibility for it. So the Trump Tower meeting in June is important.
And how important is it, is the central importance, the central question, how much information or even perhaps some type of participation the then candidate, now president, would have had in the meeting? Is that the question?
Well, that's one of the questions. What was discussed in that meeting? And was information then relayed to then candidate Trump? Because you'll recall, after that meeting, or in the days leading up to that meeting, candidate Trump was on the campaign trail talking about some big revelation to come regarding Hillary Clinton. And so that's why the particulars of that meeting and who was aware of that meeting, it's important.
And when we mentioned Roger Stone and we mentioned that meeting and we mentioned the Democratic emails, I notice on my bingo card Julian Assange names still needs to be touched. Julian Assange, he could somehow play a role in this as well.
Yeah, this is, there's so many different pieces to this puzzle. It's really remarkable. And I think some people, understandably, are numb to it. But just think about the fact that when this first started, and it officially started in July of 2016, but, the public really didn't start paying attention to it until after the election and during the transition. But think about if we told you then that, a year and a half, almost 2 years later, we would have more than 35 companies, people indicted. More than 100 charges against various organizations, companies, people. I mean, this is a major investigation. This country has not ever in its history seen anything like this. It is complicated, but it is also important.
Okay, Jeff Begay at our D.C. Bureau. Thanks so much for your contribution. As we come up on the top of the hour, Jesse Weber, can you give us just a short, for people that are just coming to this, what did we learn today, and what's the significance of it?
Real short? That Manafort
I don't know.
is
Medium short.
Okay, if we start with Cohen, I think he overstated the value of his information that he provided to the special counsel's
Prosecutors
office.
Not impressed.
No, we all thought that, and I think he thought that he was going to get the same kind of leniency that was recommended by Mueller's office in terms of Flynn. But he overstated the value of his information and how complete his information was. So when you look at what he's going to be sentenced to, he's most likely going to be facing a significant fine and several years in prison. You move over to Manafort. Here's a guy who really has a very bleak future in front of him, okay? He doesn't have much incentive to cooperate. When you really break it down, what is he looking for? A pardon from President Trump? Even if he was to get that, there are still state charges that could be brought against him. Basically, his life is going to be in prison. So what we're waiting to see is that, does the special counsel's office really, are they making a valid argument that he lied? And based upon the memo that we saw today, oh yeah, it certainly seems like that he lied about 5 different areas that are tangentially related to the special counsel's investigation. We're not entirely sure what, because so much of it has been redacted, but we can get a sense that he lied about significant details. And they did an ultimatum. They said, listen, if you want to fight this, if you want to challenge this, come after us. We have the evidence to prove that you lied, and that means that he is going to face potentially other charges.
The Cohen sentencing, we won't have to wait long for details on. It happens next week.
Right.
If you're Paul Manafort, 69 years old, facing more years in prison than you're likely to live, short of some technological miracle in the next decade or two, and so you're hoping for a pardon. I know, Caitlin, it is very hard to say what the president can or could do, but is it politically viable for him to pardon Paul Manafort?
Well, remember, the first person that he pardoned was Sheriff Joe Arpaio, the Arizona sheriff who was found guilty for contempt of court. So he has set a precedent for these pardons, and he has really faced no real political consequences for them. Now, remember,
this would be something different.
We just had an election in which Democrats just won 40 seats in the House. They have subpoena power now come January 3rd officially. We're going to have divided government. We have seen, though, over the course of this whole investigation that the president has, strategically undermined this investigation, and it has had an effect among the public. You kind of mentioned, and we've been talking about the way in which to kind of figure all of this out and to remember all of the characters. It's kind of like a scene from Homeland sometimes. You have to kind of pinpoint where everybody is and all of the actors involved. And the president has really tried to capitalize on that. Now, that has worked so far for him, but now we're seeing actual filings from Mueller. Now we're seeing that it would be very much more difficult for him to do anything about this.
Okay. Thank you both. Thank you all. We're going to do a little bit of a reset here. For those of you just joining us, the president's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, told the special counsel's office he was in touch with a Russian national seeking, quote, political synergy with the Trump campaign during the fall of 2015. Now, that's according to a new filing we've been discussing from special counsel Robert Mueller. It was released on Friday afternoon, and that same filing says that Cohen has gone to, quote, significant lengths to assist special counsel Robert Mueller. In a separate filing on Friday, Mueller charged that the president's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, told, quote, discernible lies about his contacts with someone believed to be connected to Russian intelligence. We begin with Paula Reed on the Cohen documents.
What do you think is going to happen today?
Michael Cohen was spotted in New York today shortly before federal prosecutors told a judge he deserves a substantial prison term. In a case involving campaign finance violations, prosecutors did not advocate for leniency because they allege Cohen's crimes reveal a man who knowingly sought to undermine core institutions of our democracy in order to profit personally. The president's former personal attorney had also been cooperating in special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. In a separate memo to the judge, lawyers from the special counsel's office say Cohen met with them 7 times and provided useful information about discrete Russia-related matters core to its investigation. They also reveal Russia reached out to the Trump campaign as early as November 2015, offering political synergy and proposing a meeting between candidate Trump and Vladimir Putin. This morning, in anticipation of the filings, President Trump on Twitter again called the special counsel investigation a total witch hunt. He vowed to release his own report to rebut Mueller's findings.
Paula Reed now joins us from outside the Justice Department, I understand. Paula, for you, what's the headline from these Mueller memos?
Well, these are much more newsy than we expected. I mean, what we see here is that while the special counsel and federal prosecutors are grateful for Cohen's help, they still believe that he should face substantial jail time. And it was interesting to see how they characterize his crimes, arguing that he's someone who tried to undermine core institutions of our democracy for personal profit. It was also interesting to see specifically what he has pleaded to, including the revelation of these contacts with the Trump campaign as early as November 2015 with some Russians who were seeking political synergy. That, of course, gets to the core of this investigation about questions about any conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. As for Mr. Manafort, we knew that he had lied. We didn't know specifically what he had lied to the special counsel about. Now we're getting more details about that. And I think the newest, sort of most surprising thing is that he was lying to the special counsel about his contacts with Trump administration officials as recently as May of this year. And of course, the big question is, well, why was he trying to conceal his contacts with the administration?
And there's this curious thing that remains in these memos where the president is individual one. Remind us why.
That's right. So when it was revealed that Cohen was cooperating with special counsel but would also be charged, he said that he had testified that he had discussed with both the president, who at times is sometimes referred to individual as individual one. Sometimes, though, for example, in Cohen's statement in court, he referred to the president as the president. He revealed that he had discussed the Trump Tower Moscow project with the president and members of his family during the campaign as late as June 2016. So, some people are sort of sarcastically referring to the president now as individual one. But the fact is, during that Cohen case, they did confirm. Cohen said individual one is the president.
And we've been asking this next steps question. What are the next steps in this investigation?
Well, I think there's a lot of speculation that this will be wrapping up soon. People see this flurry of activity, but that's just not true. Paul Manafort will not be sentenced until February, and also he'll be sentenced again in March. We know from our sources that witnesses continue to go before the grand jury to testify against Roger Stone. We do expect Stone will likely be charged in this case. We also expect Jerome Corsi. We know that his lawyers are in touch with the special counsel about a possible plea deal. If they can't reach a deal, he's also going to be charged. And the special counsel continues to exist until everyone who's been charged has been fully adjudicated. So anyone who thinks that the special counsel is going to wrap up in the next few weeks, I mean, the facts of this case just do not support that.
Okay, Paula Reed outside the Department of Justice. Thanks a lot, Paula. CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns is here with me now, and Jesse Weber is an attorney and host at the Law and Crime Network. Good to see you both. Okay, so we get these, I guess, in total 3 memos. Jesse, what did we learn from them?
We learned a lot, actually. First, if we can start with Cohen. Cohen clearly overstated the value of the information that he was going to provide. What you can read from that memo is that he was not as forthcoming and complete with the information that we all thought he might be. And we were all wondering whether or not he was going going to get the same recommended treatment that Mr. Flynn got at the beginning of the week. And what you basically learned was they said he should maybe get some special treatment, but not much. Yes, he provided information to the special counsel's office, and he provided information about other investigations, but it was not as forthcoming. He should be sentenced appropriately and harshly. Yeah. Oh, would you like me to continue? Yeah. So
sure. And I was just going to say there were also in the case of Cohen these two memos telling somewhat contrasting stories.
I'm glad you mentioned that. So there was two. There was one from Robert Mueller's office, and there was also from the Southern District of New York. The one that you can look at really is the Southern District of New York, because that was the really harsh memo where they said he's not a hero in this story. And I love that line more than anything. He's not the hero of this story. He only tried to provide information at the last minute to save himself, which you can compare to Flynn, who was pretty forthcoming at the very beginning, which is why Robert Mueller's team said, hey, he should be recommended no prison time. Robert Mueller's memo in relation to Cohen said he did provide assistance in our investigation, and at the very least, whatever he is sentenced to for lying to Congress, that sentence should be served concurrently with whatever he is sentenced to for those financial crimes, which means he would be serving them together. Not so great for him, but not the worst situation.
Meaning you serve less time because one day served counts in both sentences.
Otherwise, you'd be serving one sentence, and then when you finish that, you go on to the next one. So it's better. But again, when you're looking at, I think he's going to be spending a few years in prison and face a significant financial penalty as well.
And then also we get maybe an hour later, the Mueller team trying to indicate why they believe Paul Manafort broke his agreement to testify truthfully, and they outline several ways that they say he lied.
Right. We were all interested to see two things. One, do they have enough information to back that claim up? There's one thing saying that in court and others seeing the document. And what we actually saw there 5 key areas where they claimed that he provided false information. And they even at the very end of the memo said, if you want to challenge this, Manafort's team, you can come right at us. We have the evidence to back this up. And they seem to suggest he could be faced with other charges based upon lying to them, which is interesting to note because Manafort is in a different position than Cohen and Flynn. He's an elder gentleman. Okay, he seems to be suffering from some sort of medical condition, and he is already facing significant prison time. And even if the president were somehow to pardon him for his federal crimes, he is still susceptible to state crimes, which means, if in my betting opinion, if you had to ask me, he would be spending the rest of his time in prison. So the question is, yes, he lied, but why would he lie? If he doesn't really have an incentive to help, maybe he has other reasons for not providing complete and true information.
Well, and the president has described him as a stand-up guy who's not rolling over. And in fact, one of the 5 ways the special counsel says he misled investigators was that he coordinated with the White House, talked to them about the case. Caitlin Huey-Burns, good day, bad day for the White House?
It's hard to see how it's a good day for the White House, but the president has responded quite positively. He said that.
And where did he do that, Caitlin?
Let's take
one
guess.
Guess. Give me 3 guesses.
Here, we can pull it up right on Twitter, as we expected. We do now, though, have statements from the White House. You know, we saw the tweet from the president saying everything's fine. We've seen him do that throughout the course of this investigation, though. Every time something new comes out, he immediately goes to what this means for him or what he believes it means for him. And Sarah Sanders, exactly, totally clears the president. Of course, that there is, we're calling through this. Sanders, evoking some of the language that we're seeing in this indictment, in this filing, saying that Mr. Cohen has repeatedly lied. As the prosecution has pointed out to the court, Mr. Cohen is no hero. That's from Sarah Sanders, White House press secretary. So we've seen with Cohen especially, the president has thrown him under the bus. He's done with Cohen, who has been his loyal fixer, and we saw the extent of that relationship in these filings, and is basically trying to make the case that Cohen has been out for himself, that he's been trying to lessen his own sentence, and that this has nothing to do with him. However, we see from these filings that individual one is mentioned a lot of times, and that is the president.
You mentioned the Cohen statement. We looked at the Manafort one, so why don't we just read the Manafort one quickly? Sarah Huckabee Sanders, of course, the White House spokeswoman, saying the government's filing in Mr. Manafort's case says absolutely nothing about the president, and then goes on to say it says even less about collusion and is devoted almost entirely to lobbying-related issues. Once again, the media is trying to create a story where there isn't one. So that's the White House spin on the man at the top of your screen, Paul Manafort, and what we learned in the memo from the man on the bottom of your screen this afternoon. So, Jesse, what next for this investigation? What do we learn about the cards Robert Mueller is holding tonight?
Every time you see one of these filings or you see an indictment, all it is about getting information to tell the complete picture. And really, that's what it is. What information did he get from Flynn? What information did he get from Cohen? And one thing to note about what you just said with Manafort, that is not the only information he provided Robert Mueller's office. That's the information that he claims that the Robert Mueller's office is saying that he lied about. So what did he tell him about?
Couldn't have lied about everything.
What don't we know? Because, and I've mentioned this to you before, I was curious to know the information that he had about that Trump Tower meeting.
Right.
Because that is what I was really looking out for. Didn't see it so much. It might be underneath all that redaction somewhere, but maybe not so much. So when you see this, he's building a case. We expect a report. When that report will come out, it's difficult to say because every week we get a new person that's indicted. And all that means is new information coming forward, and they have to corroborate that information.
But you've expressed concerns for what these demonstrable lies say about the strength, or at least the timeliness, of Robert Mueller's investigation moving forward.
Absolutely. See, if you're Robert Mueller and you're building a case, in a perfect world, everybody that you speak to is telling the truth. Everybody that you get in a plea deal for is telling the truth. Everybody, that would be the best case scenario. Here, if you have Manafort, and he's now lying about 5 key areas that we're not even entirely sure how it's connected to President Trump or the Russian probe, now it's a step back. Now it's a step back, and he's not happy about this. His office is not happy about this 1 second. So when you see this, everybody was expecting when we first heard Manafort was in legal trouble, what information does he have? Now we have to reset and think about this. Now he has Cohen, and which we just learned didn't provide even the kind of substantial information that maybe Flynn had provided. I think the biggest thing from this week was the substantial assistance from Michael Flynn.
Okay, Caitlin Ewley-Burns, Jesse Weber. What, 2 hours of analysis? Don't know how you did it. Glad you did. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. Much news still ahead. Stick with us. You're watching CBSN, CBS News, always on. The man who ran over and killed a woman last year in Charlottesville, Virginia, has been convicted of first-degree murder. James Fields was accused of intentionally driving his car into a crowd of counter-protesters at a white nationalist rally and was stoic when the verdict was read Friday. People actually celebrated outside the courthouse, as you can see. Prosecutors said Field was driven by hate. Don Daler is at the courthouse.
Jurors took 7 hours to convict 21-year-old James Fields Jr. of all 10 counts, including first-degree murder, malicious wounding, and failure to stop at the scene of an accident. On August 12, 2017, the Unite the Right rally, led by white supremacists and neo-Nazis, had seen outbreaks of violence before it took a deadly turn, when Fields deliberately drove his car into a crowd of people, sending victims flying and killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer. 35 people were injured, some severely. Prosecutors presented video and witnesses to describe in vivid detail how Fields, who had attended the right-wing rally earlier, paused in his car, backed up slowly, then accelerated into the crowd. They used the Ohio native's own words and postings against him. A meme from 3 months earlier showing a car plowing into protesters with the words, "You have the right to protest, but I'm late for work." A text to his mother as he traveled to the protests with a picture of Hitler and the warning, "We're not the one who need to be careful." And a jailhouse recording of him scolding his mother for having pity on the family of Miss Heyer. "She's a communist," he said, "an anti-white liberal." Some of those gathered outside the courthouse cheered the verdict.
I thank every last one of those jurors for doing what they needed to do. They made the choice.